Hi everyone. This video covers Descartes' third meditation, and I will leave a link down below to the version that I'm using on the screen. He starts off in this meditation by saying, I am a thinking thing, which is the conclusion that he's arrived at after the first two meditations. He says, in this first knowledge, doubtless, there is nothing that gives me assurance of its truth except the clear and distinct perception of what I affirm. So here we are introduced to the idea of the notion of clear and distinct ideas. These are things that he is absolutely certain of, and the prime example of this is the cogito ergo sum, or that saying, I think, therefore I am. So what is he absolutely certain of? His existence, his being. And just so you know, clear and distinct ideas, these are defined as undeniable and unconfusable ideas. These are the things he's absolutely certain of. He continues, nevertheless, I before received and admitted many things as wholly certain and manifest, which yet I afterward found to be doubtful. What then were those? And he mentions the existence of objects external to himself and matters of arithmetic and geometry. So these are things that he thought he knew clearly, but in fact he didn't know clearly. And the reason why is in the first and second meditation, he discovered that these things could be doubted. He wasn't sure about those things. And he mentions here, again, the evil demon or the malignant demon who sets out to deceive him even about mathematics. And he says that he cannot rule out the possibility that God or some evil demon rules the universe with the sole purpose of deceiving him. So because of that, he cannot trust his perceptions of the natural world and his mathematical or geometrical beliefs. So he says here that he must inquire whether there is a God as soon as any opportunity of doing so shall present itself. And he says, if I find that there is a God, I must examine likewise whether he can be a deceiver, for without the knowledge of these two truths, I do not see that I can ever be certain of anything. And so the purpose here in the third meditation is to prove the existence of God. Skipping down a bit, but among these ideas, some appear to me to be innate, or something he's born with, others adventitious, or based on sense perception, and others to be made by himself, or factitious, which I would say are just fictions, like belief in a unicorn. These are ideas in our minds that are just made up. To continue, he says, for example, I find in my mind two wholly diverse ideas of the sun. The one by which it appears to me extremely small draws its origin from the senses, and should be placed in the class of adventitious ideas. The other, by which it seems to be many times larger than the whole earth, is taken up on astronomical grounds, that is, elicited from certain notions born within me. So he's making a distinction here. He's just showing how we can come to these different beliefs about things based on whether we're using our sense perceptions or we're using our innate ideas. And he shows that if you use your sense perceptions in regards to your belief about the sun, you might come to think that the sun is a very, very small thing, but based on other astronomical or scientific ideas, you would come to the conclusion that the sun is actually a very large thing, much larger than the earth. So he comes now to this point that this is called the causal principle. He says, it is manifest by the natural light that there must at least be as much reality in the efficient and total cause as in its effect. For whence can the effect draw its reality if not from its cause? So he's going to use this principle to prove the existence of God down below. He says, it follows not only that what is cannot be produced by what is not, but likewise that the more perfect, in other words, that which contains in itself more reality, cannot be the effect of the less perfect. And this is not only evidently true of those effects whose reality is actual or formal, but likewise of ideas whose reality is only considered as objective. So here's another two terms that need to be defined: objective reality and formal reality. Now, objective reality for him means real in the mind, the nature of an idea in one's mind. Formal reality actually means for him what we would normally think of as objective reality. So when you read this, you got to be careful. He seems to actually flip the meanings. He flipped these terms around. That's just what they meant back then by formal reality. So when he says something is formally real, that he means it exists externally to oneself out in the world. When he says it's objectively real, he's talking about the idea as having reality in one's mind. He gives the example of a stone and heat and shows how these things must be caused by something similar or greater than themselves. And then he says, even the idea of the heat or the stone cannot exist in me unless it is put there by a cause that contains at least as much reality as I conceive existent in the heat or in the stone. So not only the formal reality of these things must have causes that are equal or greater than themselves, but also the idea of heat or the stone in one's mind must also come from the ideas that are greater or equal to these ideas in as an idea in one's mind or somebody else's mind. He says, if the objective reality or perfection of any one of my ideas be such as clearly to convince me that this same reality exists in me neither formally nor eminently, and if, as follows from this, I myself cannot be the cause of it, it is a necessary consequence that I am not alone in the world, but that there is besides myself some other being who exists as the cause of that idea. So again, he can explain the ideas in his mind of stones and heat, but if he comes to something that he cannot explain, like where did that idea come from, then he will have proven, he thinks, that there's something else out there in the world besides himself. He says there is one that represents, so he's talking about the different ideas in his mind. He says there is one that represents a god, others that represent corporeal and inanimate things, others angels, others animals, and finally there are some that represent men like myself. He says with regards to all these other things, he can explain where those ideas come from by talking about how the ideas are mingled together or composed or mixed together from different things in his experience. But, skipping down, he says, there only remains therefore the idea of God, in which I must consider whether there is anything that cannot be supposed to originate with myself. By the name God I understand a substance infinite, independent, all-knowing, all-powerful, and by which I myself and every other thing that exists, if any such there be, were created. But these properties are so great and excellent that the more attentively I consider them, the less I feel persuaded that the idea I have of them owes its origin to myself alone, and thus it is absolutely necessary to conclude from all that I have before said that God exists. So, in short, he's saying that this idea of God is so great, is so infinite, so different from himself and all of his experiences that he cannot explain its existence, the idea of God, without positing the actual reality of God. So that's his argument, at least his first argument for the existence of God. But he's not done with this meditation, so let's skip down a bit. He says, on this account I am here desirous to inquire further whether I, who possess this idea of God, could exist supposing that there were no God. So he's going to continue down this road exploring this, the reality of God given the idea of God, but it appears here that he's actually suggesting or proposing a different type of argument. So this might be a second argument for the existence of God in the third meditation. He says, perhaps from myself, he says he's talking about his own existence. Where does my own existence come from? Not the idea of my existence, but my own existence. Where could it come from? He says maybe it comes from myself, maybe it comes from my parents, or from some other cause less perfect than God, and of course, maybe from God himself. He says, I should have bestowed upon myself every perfection of which I possess the idea, and I should thus be God. That is, if he had created himself. If he had created himself, he would not be asking these questions. He would know everything because he would have given that existence or that knowledge to himself. He says if that seems strange to you, he thinks here he says that it's much more difficult to imagine creating oneself out of nothing, which in fact would have needed to happen if you created oneself, than just giving oneself all of the knowledge in the universe. And he says, he says, if I created myself, why didn't I go further and just give myself all of the knowledge in the universe? I clearly don't have all of the knowledge in the universe, so I must not have created myself, in short. Okay. He says, because I was in existence at a short time ago, it does not follow that I must now exist unless in this moment some cause create me anew, as it were, that is, conserve me. So there's this distinction between being created or creating something and conserving something, which means sustaining it in existence. So once the creator creates that thing, there also is the question of how that creator will sustain the thing in existence. He continues, all that is here required, therefore, is that I interrogate myself to discover whether I possess any power by means of which I can bring it about that I, who now am, shall exist a moment afterwards. So if I'm this all-powerful creator and created myself, then I must also have the power to sustain myself. But he says, I'm conscious of no such power. I have no ability to sustain my existence, to sustain myself in existence for a moment longer, and so therefore I must not be the creator of myself. He then considers this. He says, perhaps the being upon whom I am dependent is not God, and I have been produced either by my parents or by some cause less perfect than deity. But, he says, this cannot be, for as I have before said, it is perfectly evident that there must at least be as much reality in the cause as in the effect, and that wouldn't be the case here. He says there also can be no infinite regress of causes, because we're not just concerned about one's initial cause or trace back to the beginning who started it, but also who conserves it or sustains my existence in the very present moment. He also says, nor can it be supposed that several causes concurred in my production, because he thinks that whatever gave him the idea of these perfection must also be the one who pulls them together in a unity to explain it to him. He wraps up the third meditation by saying that it remains only the inquiry as to the way in which I received this idea from God, for I have not drawn it from the senses, nor is it even presented to me unexpectedly, as is usual with the ideas of sensible objects, when these are presented or appear to be presented to the external organs of the senses. It is not even a pure production or fiction of my mind, for it is not in my power to take from or add to it, and consequently there but remains the alternative that it is innate in the same way as is the idea of myself. So he considers the three possibilities. This idea of God either comes from my senses as a construction of my mind, or it's innate, and he concludes that it must be innate. I hope you found that overview of the third meditation helpful.